We all have it. You're not going to escape. If you have a heartbeat, you're going to have stress.
Yeah.
I think how we manage it and how we deal with it is what a lot of leaders, and specifically ministry leaders, really struggle with, because there's a paycheck tied to your moral performance.
Yeah.
And so anytime that you have, you're compensated and your family's livelihood is based on how well you're performing, not just in your job, but morally, right? Like, and so I think a lot of leaders go into hiddenness because they feel like, I can't share my stress. I can't share my pain. I can't share the pressure I'm feeling with anyone because I don't want them to think less of me, because I'm supposed to know what I'm talking about and I'm supposed to be the spiritual leader.
Right.
And so how we begin to manage stress is through escapism.
Well, we are so excited to have Justin and Trisha Davis with us today on our podcast. And man, I was just telling them, I wish leadership and ministry could just be all fun in this, and it could be a fun I hope it is a fun podcast. I think it will be. In fact,
Justin with them the last time
Justin and Trisha are a blast to hang out. They are a blast to hang out with. You guys are amazing. You guys are authors, speakers, pastors, founders of Refine Us Ministry. Wrote an amazing book, Beyond Ordinary. We are so excited to get your wisdom today. So welcome.
Thanks so much for having us.
We're excited to be here.
And we're fun in short doses. You guys only had us for a weekend.
We only had you for a weekend, so
exactly. So we can be fun for anyone for a short amount of time.
Yeah, we know how much to have and when not to wear out your welcome. You guys are
That's right.
perfect.
That's right.
We can imagine staying. You know how you can imagine staying with people a little longer though.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, we're so excited to be able to spend some time with you guys. Part of our podcast and our hope is this, that we have the opportunity to learn from others' leadership and specifically how they manage their stress. Because here's what we've noticed. Have you guys noticed Ministries a little stressful? Have you noticed that?
No, not at all.
You feel like it should get easier the longer that you do it, but I feel like the stress just keeps increasing.
Exactly. You don't know what you don't know when you're younger, and then as you get older, you realize all that you do know, and that is even more stressful.
So true. Well, our dream was this, you guys, to learn from some leaders about how to manage this stress, and our story is very similar to so many stories of allowing the stress, just the crushing stress of leadership. It can either crush you or it can be a catalyst for something. And it crushed me at first, but then and then it was a catalyst for changing everything about the way I lead. And I know you guys have some similar stories in your life as well about how that became a catalyst to change how you lead and manage your stress differently. So really looking forward to diving in with you guys today for sure.
Absolutely.
Can we do a little family catch up first?
Yeah.
You've got a good number of kids, and how are they?
Door.
What are they doing?
Our house is a revolving door.
Like, if I can remember everybody's names, I'm winning. So our family literally over a span of, 2-3 years, basically doubled. We adopted our son and daughter in 2017.
Yeah, 17.
Yeah. Or 18?
17.
Yeah. See, I can't even remember the dates.
Yeah, it's all a blur.
It's all a blur.
Our son and daughter, they were 7 and 9 when we adopted them, and they are the oldest of 5 kids. So their younger siblings got adopted by another family, and we call them uncle and aunt. So we have a relationship with them. We see their siblings. Before COVID, we were pretty consistent with it. And then our older kids started graduating college and getting married. And so then we had daughter-in-laws, and man, then we went broke Christmas time and still trying to recover.
Yeah. And our youngest biological son graduated from high school, and now he's finishing up his freshman year of college this year. And so we have just 2 left in the house. So it's a freshman, and Jalen's a freshman, and Janiah is a 7th grader now. So it's been kind of a wild season since we were with you guys, you know, in Virginia. So much has changed. It's almost like every 6 years you go into a different season of life,
Right.
you know, as far as, especially if you have kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that, the adult kids and the in-laws. So how's it you're gaining family through the in-laws? That's fun too, right? You guys got married ones?
We have two married.
It is. Yeah, we have our oldest son is married. Our second born son Elijah, he and his wife recently just went through a divorce.
Oh, I'm
and
so
so
sorry.
they're in that process. And so that's, you know, you talk about leadership stress.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
is
You know, that's a
wow.
nuance that you
Yeah.
don't necessarily plan for.
Yeah.
And so he was living in Portland, Oregon. So he moved home a few months ago and
Okay.
is reacclimating after being in someplace beautiful back to Central Indiana. But he's been a huge blessing. It has been, you know, heartbreaking to see him
Sure.
and his wife go through this, but just the blessing that he has been coming back, and the season of life that he's in is way different than when he left to go to college. And so we can even see God, you know, using that. But yeah, our oldest son and his wife, they've been married for
Arguably 5 years.
almost 5 years.
Wow.
And if her family lived close to us, we would be best friends. Like, we love hanging out with them. They're just a phenomenal family. Riley, Micah's wife, is amazing, and they're planting their very first church. And so, so they're in for some leadership stress that they don't even know what looks like yet. So,
But I will say, you know, the topic of your podcast being about leadership, you know, we joke about how hard leadership is, especially leading in the church. But having adult children is another podcast in and of itself. Yeah. But I will say, like, all of those leadership truths that you have walked beside people in your congregation, we are now walking alongside them with our adult children. And it's allowed really hard things to still remain beautifully redemptive, even the hard. And so our son that's going through the divorce, like, that's what Justin and I have done for 12 years when we launched Refine Us 12 years ago. And we love our daughter-in-law, and she knows that we love her.
Yeah.
And so, you know, as hard as it is, we are getting to that season of becoming sages in our own right, and being able to, you know, go to that deep well of going, okay, this was really hard. Now, how do we come alongside our kids in a way that's honoring and loving? And we did score on both sets of daughter-in-law's families, because if our other daughter-in-law's family lived here, we would be best friends as well. So we've been even blessed in that side of it.
absolutely.
That's awesome. What a great perspective, because you guys get to share perspective. You just said, well, we'll see, when we said about because that's right, we will see, and they don't have to do the same things we did, and they can learn from that. And I think that's true in leadership. We don't want anyone who's listening to this to be like, oh my gosh, like, don't you ever worry, like, Micah's going into ministry and you're thinking, like, how did that happen? Did you not see any of this?
Well, when they decided, he was a youth pastor for 3.5 years. And when they decided to plant the church, we were in a really tough season, Trish and I and our family in general, when it came to ministry. And so we brought him over to the house and basically just said, if you can do anything else other than plant a church, please do it.
It was so funny how many people were like, oh, is this the answer to prayer? And I'm like,
Right,
heck
right.
no, we've never prayed for our kids to go into ministry.
Right.
I love that you just said that, because I get a lot of heat sometimes. Even Sue, you kind of sometimes
What?
don't like me saying that. I don't
Well,
know. I'm just
I
saying.
don't like you spreading everything out there, but
But
no, but we've
but
said
now
the
she's
same,
like, oh, I
we've-
love it when Justin says it.
No, we've said the same thing to our kids too. Like, God has really got to call you into this.
Yeah.
This is not the family business. And
Right.
Well, if there's anything else you can do, that's what I
if
heard
God's
you
not in
say
it, it's
that.
going to break you. It's too hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and you
Yeah.
guys have had so much leadership pain in your own marriage, your story, and what brought us together in your incredible book that's so authentic and so transparent. And you talk about just, like, you know, learning how to bear your souls to one another and be connected in such deep ways. And And then in your family, in your dynamic, you planted another church. Again, you know, after walking through a really painful experience in one church in your marriage, and then God redeeming that, planting another church, adding to your family, and then going through more church struggle. Tell us a little bit about what were some of the catalytic moments that you'd be willing to share with us today that we could learn from that forced you to change how you begin to manage stress. You can see the heartbeat behind me here. It's a heartbeat monitor, and we really want to talk to leaders about the heartbeat of a healthy leader, which means we manage our stress differently. But there had to have been some huge catalytic moments for you guys along the way. Tell us about some of those.
Well, I mean, I'll share kind of an initial thought, and then maybe Trish can jump in and add to it. But when we were early on in ministry, one of the very first leadership conferences I ever went to, we went to Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky, and I was probably 24, 25 years old. I was a youth pastor, and it was Trish and myself, one of the elders of our church and his wife, and then our music pastor and his wife. It was just the six of us. And Bob Russell said something at that conference that stuck with me, but I didn't really understand it at the time. He said, when God has an impossible task to do, he finds an impossible person and breaks them.
Wow.
And I'm like, well, that's tweetable. That's really kind of a great statement, you know. But at 25 years old, I never really understood or could, you know, conceptualize what that breaking process would look like. And I don't think it's necessarily a one-time thing. I think there's seasons of being broken so that you can increase your reliance on God, so that you can therefore increase your capacity to serve him. And one of the very first, obviously, times of our brokenness was during our separation after my infidelity in 2005. That was just probably 5 years after that conference. And so 2005 is when our marriage imploded, and that was really the first, I guess, tangible experience I had with what brokenness was, and just being completely broken before God with no hope, no friends, no job, no future really, not even knowing if my marriage was going to make it. And one of the things that I realized during that time is that Jesus was literally all that I had, and he became everything that I needed. And that was the first time that I felt like God came through, and, you know, a broken and contrite heart he won't deny. And that, so that, I think, you know, I could talk for a long time. I don't want to monopolize the question, but I feel like that quote and then that experience a few years later really kind of set up Trish and I to recognize seasons of brokenness and allow it to be a catalyst for growth rather than just to crush our spirit. I don't know if you have anything to...
No, that was okay. Let's
Trisha's like, I'm not following that.
Well, I think oftentimes in leadership, our thought is success is the win, but
Yeah.
good leaders can lead in healthy and winning environments, but great leaders are forged through, you know, the refinement of failure. And our first church plant just literally went up and to the right. And this was in 2002,
2, 3, 4, yeah.
where like church planting was like a 4-letter word. Like it just was not understood in a way that, you know, we were like the troubled kids that we went and did this thing called
that you weren't
church
willing
plant.
to listen to another pastor, so you got to go do your own thing or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, they were all mad at us anyway. So it was like, you know, it was kind of an island, but then on the outside looking, you know, in, God blessed it. We grew in 3 years to over 700 people, and the average age was like 28. We raised $1 million to, you know, buy property. But what we recognized is that leadership wins do not equate to healthy character.
Wow,
and so
that's
we
good.
became really great ministry leaders, but we became horrible marriage partners.
Wow. And, you know, your story is so crushing after that point, and I can't imagine walking through that while you're walking through that with a church, you know. And I think there had to have been some huge lessons that you learned along the way of what it's like to, at what point do you bail from these things? At what time do you pull out of like, hey, looking back, you've gained a lot of painful perspective. You go back to that point. I'm sure you have. And I hate to even bring it up this because it's like, I know how we've replayed.
Yeah.
Our
At
own
what point
story.
should we have pulled the plug on something and been like, this is not healthy. We need to shift. And I think it's maybe it's not more complicated in secular life than in Christian life, but there always seems to be a spirituality attached to setting boundaries in your ministry when it overlaps into the healthiness of your family or your personal life. That makes it difficult to say, you know what, this is not a good place for us. When you're at those crossroads, what did you do, or what would you have done?
Well, I think, just the topic of your podcast of being, identifying and recognizing stress. We all have it. You're not going to escape. If you have a heartbeat, you're going to have stress. I think how we manage it and how we deal with it is what a lot of leaders, and specifically ministry leaders, really struggle with, because there's a paycheck tied to your moral performance.
Yeah.
And so anytime that you have, you're compensated and your family's livelihood is based on how well you're performing, not just in your job, but morally, right? Like, and so I think a lot of leaders go into hiddenness because they feel like, I can't share my stress. I can't share my pain. I can't share the pressure I'm feeling with anyone because I don't want them to think less of me, because I'm supposed to know what I'm talking about and I'm supposed to be the spiritual leader. Right. And so how we begin to manage stress is through escapism or through, sexual sin or brokenness. And so when we don't identify those things and confess those things, we begin to manage them in unhealthy ways. And I think that's kind of where, I was in the first 10 years of ministry, and even the last, 3 years of our church plant. I, rather than looking to pornography, I just looked to food. And so, I Easter of 2022, I was the heaviest I've ever been. And looking back on that season, it was like I was trying to manage the stress the best I possibly could. And I was telling people about it, but then I was trying to bring comfort. I need immediate relief, right? And so I found immediate relief, in Chick-fil-A, and who doesn't find relief in that?
Hey, Christian chicken, man. I mean, there's ministers to your soul. I get it.
Christian fast food.
Yeah.
Christian chicken.
This podcast is not sponsored by Chick-fil-A,
but we will take free Chick-fil-A.
Brand
not
placement.
Yet, but we would love for you to consider that. Okay.
But I think that's part of our issue is, that the feelings of isolation and feeling like you have to have it all together. It kind of is the twin brother of the stress that you're feeling in ministry, and it becomes this cocktail of toxicity that you don't even know how to get out of.
You touched on something a moment ago where you talk about in your book that, you gave that iceberg illustration, or I don't know if that was just when you did that in a marriage talk or if it was in your book, but can't remember which, but you draw that iceberg, I know in your talk, and you talk about everything below the surface that's there, that's kind of waiting.
Yeah, it's interesting. When Justin confessed to the affair, there was a loss of like epic proportions. Like for me, I wasn't just losing my marriage. Because the affair happened with my best friend and a staff member, I wasn't just losing my best friend. Overnight, like with the confession, we never went back to the church. I didn't get to say goodbye. It was a breaking of everything. And it was hitting rock bottom. But what I recognize is that like rock bottom is a solid surface to stand. And what had happened is we had lived in these deep waters of hiddenness. And some of it, to be honest, we didn't even know. But, you said something that was so profound, that in ministry, we get tangled up and twisted into what is healthy boundaries and what is for Jesus. And in leadership circles, you will be told what different models and different philosophies and even different theological perspectives. But what I recognized is what happened is we sifted everything we were and should be, not through who Jesus says we should be, but through ministry. And those are two very different things. And so when you sift your life through ministry, it's very easy for that iceberg to be floating around in deep waters, and everybody's just seeing the tip of the iceberg, and it's the best version of yourself.
They're seeing the feed now. That's what we'd call it now, right?
Yeah. And then that water line starts to, and then you just feel like you're drowning. But because people just know the surface level, it's terrifying thinking that we would have to lower the water line and reveal what's underneath the surface. And when, like Justin said, when your morality is tied to your paycheck, when you have different, perspectives of what is winning as a pastor, it is a lot harder to get to a place of health on your own before implosion. And that's something that Justin and I are passionate about, because the worry we have is that you have to fail morally to find wholeness. And that could be farther from the truth, that we get the choice today to choose wholeness, not out of circumstances, but out of a will, a true leadership will to say, I want to be a different type of leader, and a leader that is okay with failure in moving forward. And it's easier said than done.
So practically speaking, what kinds of changes did you incorporate to make that shift? So you have to make the shift in your head, but then you actually have to make the shift in your daily life, which oftentimes by the whole crowd, right? Everybody that's in ministry, they see this as maybe as failure, that you're shifting the way that you do everything, you're shifting the priorities, because probably you're becoming less performance-based, and performance is how we get judged. So what changes did you make, and how did you guard yourself from getting sucked back into that performance mentality?
Well, a few things come to mind as you talk about that. And I'm not necessarily perfect at these. I think these are more of a process than they are a formula. But I think one of the things that I've recognized is I have to recognize my propensity to please people and to live for the approval of people rather than the calling that God has on my life. And that's a weakness until you recognize it, right? When you recognize it, then it becomes something that you can surrender to God and allow him to kind of change your heart on. But God doesn't change that aspect of your heart if you don't recognize, that's how you are. And I'll never forget, we had a couple that left the church during COVID, and they were I knew them. I had known them for years. And it was almost like one of my kids leaving the church.
That's so unusual to have someone leave during COVID.
Especially only to have one. We had
every pastor in the United States and around the world.
But how they left.
We don't know what that's like.
But obviously all the rules changed during COVID, and that's a whole other layer of stress. But
Sure.
How they left the church was he sent me a text message.
Yeah.
And just basically said, it's not you, it's us.
It's not you, it's me.
And it was like I had a counseling appointment later that week, and I just went in and I was just going off on my counselor about it, and he's like, "Well, who are you really mad at?" And I'm like, "I'm mad at every person that is leaving the church right now." And he's like, "No, who are you really mad at?" And I'm like, "I'm mad at God. Like I'm mad that God would put me in this position just to drop kick me." And and his pushback to me was, anytime that you need people to feel validated in ministry, you're going to use people. It doesn't matter what your intentions are. When you need them to feel good about you, you're going to use them. And it was just this wake-up call to me that not that I don't need people, but I should need people to equip them, not to make myself feel better. That's a really hard distinction to make, But I think, identifying that people pleasing. And then I think another part of that process would be giving away our shame, because we do carry a lot of shame and guilt in leadership, and we do fail, and we know the internal struggles that we have and nobody else does. And so we feel guilty about things that nobody even knows about.
Right.
And so recognizing that shame and that guilt that we carry and surrendering that to God, it takes the air out of the balloon of the stress that we're feeling constantly of trying to perform for people. And I think those two things kind of go hand in hand when it comes to, decreasing our stress level. And, obviously stress is going to come. How we navigate it and how we, handle it, I think is ultimately up to us. And I would, obviously you would say, well, read your Bible and pray. I mean, we all do that. Okay. So I'm trying to think beyond some of the Sunday school type of answers and really more to some practical soul work that I've had to do over the last 12 months to be able to stand upright and not suck my thumb in a corner after some really devastating ministry losses.
You guys, a remarkable redemption story of how God redeemed you in your lives, in your marriage. You added to your family while you were planting a church. From the outside, that top of the iceberg, Trish, that you said a little bit, from the outside, if we look at your social media, it's like, man, this is the healthiest,
awesome.
unbelievable. And that may be true, or it may or may not be true. But as you guys then went through that story and through that, were there some lessons that you were like, you know what, this is something that was different, very, very different for us this time around, so to speak?
Yeah. That's
That's a really loaded question, because we're going through a lot of stress right now with one of our kids.
You can compartmentalize it.
Again, it was this awakening to how we have a propensity as ministry leaders to put first what is the less important thing in our lives. And that is how, we put forth like, okay, I need to be successful everywhere, not just at our ministries, but at home. Everything needs to be successful. And so when that is what our focus is, then every time that we don't have a success, it takes us down in how we value ourselves in such an unhealthy way. And so there's layers of stress that are just placed on you that you are self-placing. It's not your congregation. It's not your family. And so for Justin and I, it was like this trifecta of what felt like failure. When we planted our first church, there was no social media. I think websites were just kind of like in the making. Planting a church this time around makes me literally want to like hold a sign and say, if you are a church planner, you need a hug and I'm here for you, right? Because it's different. You're not just being a pastor. You have to figure out social media. You have to figure out, like with COVID, all of a sudden no matter your size, you had to figure out how to have an online experience. And then all of that then plays into home life. And like for us, we had adopted our kids who have so much trauma that we were not aware of. I mean, we literally were, our second born was graduating from high school on a Sunday. We got a phone call the Thursday before, actually an email, the Thursday before his graduation about our son and daughter. We went through the ceremony on Sunday and we're like, woo, number 2 is out of the house. We've got one more to go. And then the next day on Monday, we talked to our kid's birth mom. And that Saturday, they were home with us forever. It was a very quick, we had to raise, it wasn't through foster care. It was through truly adoption. And so we had to raise $30,000 and people just rallied. And we did in 8 days.
Wow.
And again, right, that ministry leader comes out where we're like, oh my gosh, God has blessed us. We raised $30,000 in 8 days.
Wow.
Who does that? Well, not the Davises, right? It's God.
Right.
And then you bring these babies home and then you're like, we have no idea what we're doing. So it was like success, success, success,
Right.
and then real life started. And what we realized is that we were so unprepared to be trauma parents.
Wow.
And it was a collision of being a church planner, which is hard and beautiful in its own right, but it was growing. And I think it was Christmas of 2019, we had over 600 people, show up. Now, of those 600 people, I would say, because our church was all over the map, I would say probably 100 of those were families that came in and to visit. But still, like 3 years in, to be a church of 500 was amazing.
Yeah.
We moved into a building, this ginormous old kind of dilapidated building of a church that was dying. And there was like, we were going to merge and it was going to be beautiful.
Yeah,
and
I remember that part of your
building.
story. It was so cool. And we thought, wow, this is a huge win.
Yeah, it was like the $30,000 we raised. It was amazing. And then bam, we don't know what we're doing as parents. And then we're, 4 years into this church plant and it's exploding and we're buying chairs and it's amazing. And that we're going to do like a grand opening in this new space. And then COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And COVID changed everything. And so our everything scattered and sheltered. And so we were sheltered with our trauma kids trying to do school,
Right.
who were just unraveling. And I would say the average family had their own unraveling story, but then we had unraveling in our church.
Yeah.
And it was different leadership waters that, man, did the water line start to grow for Justin and I, because it just felt like you couldn't even figure out which way was up or down. We were just letting the current take us.
Right.
And it became this, what should have been a season for many of us as leaders became the new normal. And out of the normal, I think just today in 2023, we are beginning to recognize the dysfunctional patterns that we got into. And like Justin said, it's going back to the basics of saying, man, who am I trying to please in this? And in that, like, how much of that has become my identity? And that's some of the, real wrestling that I think is happening for many leaders.
I think, you said something about performance, Justin. When people keep putting a microphone in your hands and they keep putting a spotlight on you and they keep showing up, you have to do it. You feel like you have to do it. That drives a lot of this. And then as you're moving towards this, I know your story right now, the church went through a huge upheaval and hardship, and you ended up closing the church. Was any part of that, and a part of that decision, what part of that was relief to you and what part of that was grief? And how did you process and figure out which part was what and lean into that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's a mixture of all of that. But in 2021, we were, trying to make a comeback like everybody was. And in the process of, people coming back in the building, and I think we had a Easter service in 2021 that was in person. And that was our biggest crowd that we had since COVID. Shortly after that time, through a number of different circumstances, I found out that my dad wasn't my biological dad. And that was obviously a pretty devastating revelation, and dealing with the aftermath of that. At the same time, Trisha did Ancestry.com and had a conversation that revealed that her dad wasn't her biological dad.
Wow.
And so within a span of 10 days, we both find this information out. And there's a lot more to the story that I don't have time to go into, but it took Trish out. Like, she went to on-site, kind of a trauma center just outside of Nashville. She was there for 8 days.
I call it trauma camp.
Trauma camp.
And so
That's a great concept.
Yeah, that is a great concept.
so you have this horsepower that's required,
Yes.
like never before, to try to rebuild something that has not any fault of your own been completely decimated by the circumstances that everybody was going through. And the pressure that we had to figure this out, because our lease was ending and our offering was going down. And so we get to January of 2022, and Trisha and I are sitting out on our back porch, out in our screened-in porch, just kind of talking. And I just said, maybe we're not healthy enough to do this, like emotionally.
Right.
Maybe we just are so fractured right now. We can't be what is required to do this. And so I went to we had 10 or 11 small groups at that time. I went to every single small group. I went part-time at the church because we didn't have enough money to pay me, and told all of our small groups, hey, if something doesn't change between now and Easter, we're going to have some really difficult conversations. And so, to their credit, giving started going up a little bit, and engagement started going up a little bit. And then we lost our lease. They subleased the space the church that we were renting subleased the space that we were renting to a homeschool co-op. And that just felt like, it felt like a dagger. Like that was just like, and we weren't like, we were so low on resilience at that point.
Yeah.
It wasn't like I had a lot of willpower to try to figure it out. You know what I mean? Like I think the 25-year-old me or the 30-year-old me would be like, let's take another hill.
Yeah.
And I was like, let's just, for me, I was just like, let's just die on this hill right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, that it was at that point, I think our board in their wisdom wanted to relieve us of the decision to close the church. So one of them brought it up, another one of them kind of seconded it, and they didn't have to talk us into it, but it became almost a gift that we were given of not having to make that decision solely and talk them into it. And man, I'm getting emotional just thinking about that now.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever really articulated it that way. So here's what was so frustrating in the process, and those of you in ministry can relate to this. So we had about 80 people in person the week before we announced the church was going to close. We sent out an email saying no online service this week. We didn't want people to log in halfway through it.
Right.
In person only. 170 people show up.
Oh.
And the amount of anger that was there for the people who had carried us through COVID, you could feel it in the room.
Yeah.
So we announced the church is closing. The next week is Easter. So it was a really awkward Easter talking about a resurrection when you just had something that wasn't going to come back to life.
Yeah.
And so, but we had 370 people for Easter.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the last week of the church, we had like 260. We had to set up extra chairs. And I had a counseling session that week, and I went into my counselor and I just said, here's how I feel right now. I said, I feel like everyone saw us on life support and they just wanted to come to the funeral. And so there was a lot of sadness and a lot of grief that accompanied that.
Yeah.
I think the further I've gotten away from it, that grief is still real, but the relief has also been as tangible. Not the relief of not being in ministry, but just the exhaustion that I felt of, there's a momentum that you have in ministry that you don't have to create, that God brings. And we were just in a season, I don't think that God was punishing us, but we were just having to create our own momentum all the time. Wow. I just felt like I was constantly on Instagram trying to convince people to come, constantly on Facebook. You don't want to miss this weekend. Well, they were going to miss it, right? I mean, like 70% of the people were missing it. So it didn't matter what I said. Right. And so I think just that aspect of trying to sell myself and sell the church and sell how great it's going to be, it's been a huge relief.
It feels like you're either selling or defending, right?
Yeah. So there has been a sense of loss, but I think, we're coming up on a year now since the church closed. And looking back, I can see how God has used that in our life to help us find health and healing in a way that we would not. We could have maybe experienced it. I don't see the pathway to it had we kept the church open.
Trisha, from a wife perspective, of course, you're in ministry. You're in all of it anyway. Wives carry the load in a different way, I think, than the husband. If he's the front guy or whatever, he's you're each carrying the load, but you process it differently and it comes out differently. Do you have any advice for, or looking back, like what was healthy for you in processing it, and what was maybe the non-healthy natural process that you have to fight against to come out on the other side resilient, you know what I mean? And not bitter and angry and unable to move on.
Yeah. I don't know.
Or are you still there? Like this is my struggle.
Hold on, let me take my gloves off. And, Justin and I found a book right before we began to launch called Rocket Fuel that really just changed Justin and I's. We've always co-labored together. In that, when it was on point, we were magical together. When it was off kilter, we were toxic. It's a great word. And Rocket Fuel talks about that there are two different people in an organization as co-leaders, co-laborers, and there's the visionary, which is Justin, and then there's the integrator. And an integrator is sometimes called a COO, different than a manager. And this book just defined and refined how we operated. And it's a co-authored, and they, give examples of like Walt Disney and his brother, and lots of examples like that. And so
Henry Ford and his brother.
Henry Ford, yeah. And so that's how Justin and I, we had such clarity. So I managed the staff and day to day, and I loved my job. But there were circumstances of trying to be a mom and a wife in some of the like hardest leader. Like I told Justin, it was so funny. We should have like videoed this or journaled it. I'm like, during COVID, I'm like, if one more podcaster comes out with how to lead through a church through COVID, who is not leading a church through COVID, I'm going to find them, and I'm putting my gloves on. I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But so my perspective is a little bit different, is that because we co-led together, we could have been really toxic. But by God's grace, I think oftentimes ministry is hard, but I believe that ministry oftentimes is hard because we don't give ourselves permission to make ministry healthy. And so you have to define what that is for you as an individual leader, as a couple, and as a family. And if you are leading a church and you've got kids in college, it's going to change your ability to lead than if you have littles. And for us, we found ourselves in a season of raising trauma kids. So you had trauma in our home. And then for the first time as pastors, we were all leading churches of collective trauma.
Yeah.
It was the first time that everybody was going through the same thing and had very strong feels on how to handle that. And so I think what I'm most proud of is that Justin and I fought really hard to figure out, how do we co-labor well in the dysfunction that is our world right now, and of the pain of our church? And communication was key. And I would say communication and how we held space for each other. Because sometimes I would meet with the board that Justin wasn't there. There was 6 months where he was working a full-time job in the banking industry, and I was leading the church, and he's our vision guy. So while I was keeping the train on the rails, there was no vision, we missed him. And so how we held space for each other was a game changer. And then how we made the hard decisions that were going to probably embarrass us. I think oftentimes we don't choose hard things because we're going to be embarrassed by it. Like in the little things, like, hey, let's try this event, and 4 people show up, and you're like, well, stink.
Yeah.
You know what? Instead of canceling it, let's try it next year. And then 7 people show up. Like we kind of force what we think is going to be the win rather than going, man, we tried, we failed. Sometimes I believe our families and our congregations learn more out of our failure and seeing our character out of our failure than just the wins. Everybody wants to win. That is the goal. Like we want to be growing and healthy, But in order to do that, we have to be willing to hold space for each other. We have to be willing to take a hit to our pride and know that we're not going to have all the answers. And I think because we were very intentional with each other in those spaces, not only did it keep us healthy in the midst of such unhealth, talk about identity crisis.
Right.
I mean,
Sure.
my dad's Hispanic. So like when I found out my dad wasn't my dad, like identity crisis in a way that I still don't have words, losing the church and losing that identity as pastors. Like there was a lot that the old Justin and Trisha, it would have taken us out. But when you truly know who you are in Christ, the grief in the loss is still really real. What is different this time is that it did not change my value. And when you lead to find value in your leadership, you'll always be disappointed. And that is the beauty of being able to lead in a space of your faith, is because you get to lean in that anchor at all times. It isn't conditional, and it isn't, it's not based on wins or losses. It just is.
That's so
great.
good.
Wow.
That's so good. You guys, I'm just proud to know you guys, because I think the decisions that you have made are so courageous, and to be able to step out of something you've worked and given everything to, it's so courageous. And what should have been celebrated as a win, many times people look at like as failure.
Yeah. People call that a failure to stop when something needs to be stopped.
And
Because they don't mind sitting in they don't mind sitting in the audience going, oh, look, they're doing terrible. Oh, they're doing good today. Like it's
no sweat off them.
it's fandom for them, or criticism or whatever. And you're the one in the arena. You know, it's the age old, the man in the arena story. Right. I echo that. It's courageous to know when it's time to get out of the arena.
And Justin, you had an interesting story shared on your podcast of, here's this, you guys made this courageous decision, and shortly after that, someone asked you to speak on lessons in failure, and it was kind of a little bit very, very ironic to me, but at the same time, how did you even process that, and how do you guys process that, going forward?
It's funny. He asked me if I would do a message on lessons learned from failure, and I said, "Well, how about a 5-week series?"
Yeah,
that's how much content I have.
One lesson's not going to get
There,
it.
this is the next book.
Exactly. Obviously, I think one of the things that I've committed to is I'm very success driven, and I heard a quote by Craig Rochelle, a few years ago that really sticks with me. He says, people are impressed with your wins, but they connect to your losses.
So good.
And I just thought, okay, I have a perception of myself that other people don't have, right? Because from the outside looking in, I was on staff at a mega church. We've written a book. We go and speak at other churches. Like there's this perception that we're doing something that people aspire to do. And I don't take that for granted. I'm grateful for that. At the same time, the personal and the ministerial failures that we've accumulated are really real. And those aren't necessarily always posted on Instagram. And so I've just kind of made a commitment that I'm going to share as much about my failures as I am about my successes, because I think Paul said it best. I'm the greatest of all sinners, right? And I think that's why he was able to, I will be everything to all people so that some may, know Christ. And so I don't see a lot of great success coming out of the life of Jesus. I see devastating losses, the loss of friendships, the loss of, people that he trusted, the loss of his life. Every disciple except for one was martyred, right? And so
Right.
if you judge the disciples by their ministerial success, they were complete failures.
Right.
But it was through those failures that other people were able to find Christ. And so I don't necessarily look at it like I'm a failure. I feel like failure defines those that don't try again. And I feel like, God can use my greatest failures to be a launching pad of some of my greatest calling. And I was just telling somebody this the other day. I was just talking about this on Sunday with our family. It sucks sometimes that we travel around the country, and what do we talk about? We talk about the worst mistake I've made in my marriage. Like that's what I do, 24 times a year or whatever. And it can feel overwhelming. And so we go to places and people don't ask me to come back. They ask Trish to come back and speak because she's the hero of the story. I'm the villain of the story. Right. But I think that's as we look at it through, through human eyes, but God doesn't see as we see. He sees the heart. And so I hope that my heart always remains open to sharing the worst parts, because that's where God's grace shows up the most powerfully. And I think if more pastors felt comfortable sharing their failures, their churches may not grow bigger, but I think they would grow more in tune with the grace of God.
Can we lean into that a little bit before we end? Because I think we need to hear this. We struggle managing that stress and then after the catalytic moments happen, after the huge failures happen, or after this, and you look back and you go, oh, we've got to change everything. And you mentioned several really cool things. You talked about your counselor multiple times. You've talked about what you've learned. Trisha, you talked about trauma camp. I love that fun way to say it.
I'm sure on-site will appreciate that.
I think you guys should develop a trauma camp, and I will come to it.
We're coming. We're coming.
We'll be your first campers.
We're coming. But talk about some of those rhythms. I'd love us to what are some tangible things that are in some of those rhythms of managing stress, recognizing it and saying, hey, I'm not going there again. I want to make sure my emotion, my spiritual, my mental, all of that is good.
What did you just say?
Zumba.
Oh,
yeah. Get some Zumba
I have
stress out.
a crazy community, my Zumba community. I love them so much.
Love it.
Yeah, it is a great way. It's funny when I hear Justin share, that part of he goes around sharing his greatest failure. At the same time, he has 17 years of being an amazing husband and 17 years since our implosion of being an amazing dad. And those have been from built-in rhythms that we have even to this day. And one of them is, as a family, we began to sit down and talk about what are our non-negotiables for us as a family. And it gives everybody a voice at the table. And so there was a season that a non-negotiable for one of our kids is they had this event at school that we wouldn't even think it was a big deal, but it was a big deal to them. And what happened is it curated culture of I see you and I value you, so that in ministry, deaths happen, weddings happen, there are times where it's like our schedule gets crazy, and that will always consume you if you don't know what you need yourself. And so counseling is expensive. Counseling takes up time. And if you don't value it, you're not going to do it. And so counseling is a high value in our family. We probably could go on vacation for everybody in our house is in counseling. And we have been for a long time because we all have different traumas, and our joke is who's your daddy? And we're like, I don't know. So being able to laugh in the midst of it. And what has happened is through right-sizing expectations of how we show up for each other, going to counseling and knowing it's not a one-time thing. It's going to take some time. And for some of us, our counselor's you're in a good place. We don't need to see each other this often, but I'm always here. Another thing is our health. He mentioned Zumba. Working out is just not convenient ever. And we found what worked for us and what brought joy to our lives. And so for me personally, my class is in the worst time of the day, but I make it happen because sacrificing that 1 hour has changed the rest of the hours. And so finding out as a couple, and this, again, what will feel like a to-do list, it's not about a to-do list. It's about setting culture of healthy habits. And when you set those culture-changing habits, you don't allow ministry to tell you what to do. You allow yourself to say what you can do in ministry. And so
That's good.
everybody's capacity is different. Justin is like, oh my gosh, he makes me crazy because he's such a good leader. Like he is this like Michael Jordan, like his capacity is insane. And I love that about him. Mine is not. And so I was for years trying to keep up with his capacity. And I'm like, I don't have that. And, but we just keep like doing the work and having honest conversations and figuring out what that works. And why I believe in it so much is that Justin and I literally, 1, we should be divorced. 2, we should have kids that hate us. 3, we should literally be like sucking our thumbs in the corner. And we're not. And we're not because we're special, but because there is resurrection. And yes, Jesus lived a hard life, but resurrection happened. And it's beyond a Sunday morning experience. And every day we get to walk in that resurrection. And it's hard sometimes to remember that. But like, I am more in love with Justin today through the mess than I was when we first got married, not because we're older, but because we have figured out the secret sauce of learning to love each other in the mess rather than looking to external things to fix the mess.
Right.
Wow.
That's so great.
Love that. And I love that you guys are really, you're spending your lives in your ministry now, touching people in those painful places. And wow, I mean, what is more Jesus like? Justin, what a beautiful description you gave earlier about Jesus' ministry. I mean, never thought about it exactly that way. And now you guys get to do that. And I'd love to hear and let all of the leaders listening how they can connect with you and how they can walk with you in these times and what that looks like. And I know you've got a book coming out in the fall, Justin, and we want to talk about that for a moment, but just how can they connect with you? How can they go with you on this journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we, after the church closed, we obviously have been doing Refine Us since 2012 or 2010 maybe. And so that's something that we've kind of always done on the side as, ministry allowed. And it's been phenomenal for us. When the church closed, we kind of sat back for 3 or 4 months and just kind of healed and took some time. We went to a life planning retreat and just got some guidance and launched Refine Us full time in the fall. And our heart there is to really pour into marriages, families, to help families thrive. And I think as families thrive, churches thrive. Healthier families will equate to healthier churches, but also healthier pastors equate to healthier churches. And so we do marriage coaching for couples, but we do it for pastors as well and their spouses, because as pastors, we don't really feel like we have any place to go. And so we can, offer some perspective for pastors and leaders that not necessarily a traditional counselor could, given our experience. So you can go to refineus.org and learn more about that. The book I have coming out in the fall is called Being Real is Greater Than Being Perfect, How Transparency Leads to Transformation. And it really is just kind of a rallying cry for Christians to give up kind of a sanitized version of Christianity that we've been convinced pleases God and be more authentic with God, ourselves, and others. And if you look at the life of Jesus, people who were nothing like Jesus, they liked being around Jesus. And the people who were closest to Jesus felt the most comfortable being authentic with him. And there was doubt, there was, despair, there was all kinds of things, unmet expectations that were communicated to Jesus, but somehow we don't feel like we're capable or able to bring those things to God. And so it's really just finding transformation, not through behavior modification, but through authenticity and transparency.
That's good.
I love it, and I'm looking forward to going on this journey with you. And man, how great is it that not only we got to spend an hour with you, but lots and lots of leaders who will be watching get to spend some time with you. And having spent time with Justin and Trisha, it's like I love that no matter what scenario, it could be a podcast, it could be stage, it could be at a coffee shop, it could be in a restaurant. It's just Justin and Trisha. And I love I love that about you guys.
Yeah.
It just comes out in everything you do. Man, I really believe I've been feeling this way. Like the greatest years of your ministry are ahead of you. And I mean, we got to believe that Jesus said, greater works than these, only God, it makes that possible. But I think because of the fact that you're courageous and you step into that with God, I can't wait to see what's going to happen with you guys. Hey, I'd love to pray for you and ask all of you who are watching as well. Just take a moment right now while you're watching and just pray for Justin and Trisha. Thank you so much, guys, for being with us. And we want to pray for you. God, thank you for the ministry that you've taken Justin and Trisha Davis and their entire family through, God, and used them in such powerful ways. But God, I want to thank you and praise you today for the ministry that you're doing in them, even greater than the ministry you're doing through them. And Lord, I just ask you that this next season be a season that they get to see the harvest. So Lord, we pray to the Lord of the harvest. God, we pray to the Lord of the harvest. These are workers that you have shaped, that you have poured into, that you have painfully shaped on the potter's wheel. And God, just in the image that they're coming into the image and the fellowship of your suffering. So God, I pray your blessing on their ministry, pray your blessing on this upcoming book, on their podcast, on Refine Us Ministries, Lord, on the many marriage conferences they're doing, God, and on their family. So Lord, bless them in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thank you so much, guys, for being with us.
Thank you so much for coming.
Been amazing.
Yeah,
Awesome.
thank you guys for having us.
Absolutely.
Now we need to get together for real.
Yes, that's it. We're going to.
Yes, I would love that. I would love that.
Yeah, not just through
Trauma
Zoom.
camp, here we come.
That's it. I love it.
Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. Wow.
Yep.
That was amazing. Justin
Fantastic.
and Trisha Davis never disappoint. There are so many things I got. I don't know how we're going to possibly even narrow it down, but like, what are the top two? Top two, you'd say.
Top two things for me. Justin said, failure defines those that don't try again. It's a re-examining of what success is in leadership, which we get very screwed up, and it's servant leadership. I love it.
Love that.
Trisha's, I think, most profound thing to me was that establishing a culture of healthy habits is not a to-do list. It's a redefining your leadership culture. It's just changing the way that you do leadership and do your own life.
And they are pictures of just learning and learning and learning and recycling that. I loved it. One of the most profound statements to me was allow your capacity to manage your ministry rather than your ministry to manage your capacity.
Yeah.
And it's just so performance driven. You feel like you have to rise to the occasion. They talked about adjusting your expectations so you don't keep rising to the occasion of performing rather than being authentic of who you are in God. So I hope you're as encouraged today as we are. The hope and purpose of these conversations is to strengthen us as leaders to be healthy leaders, not just have healthy leadership. So stay with us on the journey. There's going to be so many more conversations to come, but thanks for being with us on Stress Test.